Think about the last time you were alone, truly alone. No notifications, no background noise, no distractions, just you and your thoughts. How did it feel? Did you embrace the stillness, or did you instinctively reach for something? Your phone, a conversation, an escape? Society has conditioned us to believe that solitude is something to be feared, a state that must be fixed. But what if it was the opposite? What if being alone was not a weakness, but an immense strength? Arthur Schopenhauer, one of the most profound and brutally honest philosophers of the 19th century, saw solitude not as a burden, but as a superpower. He argued that people who depend on relationships for their sense of fulfillment are, in a way, prisoners, chained to external validation, emotional turbulence, and the expectations of others. To him, the ability to stand alone, to think deeply, and to cultivate one's own mind was not just a sign of intelligence, but a necessity for true independence. His philosophy stands in stark contrast to modern culture. Everywhere we look, we are bombarded with messages that glorify relationships. From movies to music, from social media to family pressure, the message is clear. To be single is to be incomplete. But Schopenhauer's view dismantles this illusion. He believed that romantic entanglements more often than not lead to suffering, distraction, and self-betrayal, that in trying to merge our lives with another's, we risk losing what makes us unique, what makes us whole on our own. And this isn't just abstract theory. If you've ever felt drained by the emotional weight of a relationship, if you've ever lost sight of your own goals in the process of trying to accommodate someone else's, if you've ever felt a quiet relief in solitude while the world insists you should be seeking connection, then you already understand a truth that Schopenhauer spoke about centuries ago. He believed that love was not some grand transcendent force, but rather nature's way of tricking us into reproduction, the intense highs and lows of romance, the obsession, the desire. He saw all of it as a biological mechanism, not a personal choice. And that raises an uncomfortable question. If love is just nature's way of ensuring the continuation of the species, then is it truly the path to happiness? Or is it just another illusion, another form of control that keeps people from realizing their true potential? This is not to say that Schopenhauer believed people should live in isolation or avoid relationships entirely, but he did believe that those who embrace solitude gain something that the majority will never experience: full control over their own lives. Without the distractions of romance, without the compromises that come with relationships, a person is free to think deeply, to create, to master their own mind. They are free to pursue truth rather than validation, wisdom rather than fleeting pleasure. Modern society, however, does not celebrate solitude. It labels it as loneliness, as something to be fixed rather than embraced. We are taught that we should always be seeking someone else, that love is the ultimate goal. But Schopenhauer invites us to step back and question, who benefits from this belief? Is it truly for our own good? Or is it a form of conditioning that keeps us dependent on others for our happiness? And here lies the core of his argument. Those who cannot stand to be alone do not truly know themselves. They seek companionship not out of love, but out of fear. Fear of facing their own thoughts, fear of the silence that forces self-reflection, fear of realizing that much of what they desire has been implanted by external forces rather than their own will. But if solitude is a superpower, then why do so many avoid it? Why is the idea of being single so often met with pity rather than admiration? If solitude is a superpower, then why do so many people fear it? Why is being single often viewed as a problem to be solved rather than an opportunity to be embraced? Schopenhauer believed that much of this fear is not natural, it is conditioned. From an early age, we are taught that love is the ultimate goal, that finding a partner is a measure of success, and that to be alone is to be incomplete. But what if all of this is an illusion? At the heart of Schopenhauer's philosophy is the idea that human desires are not as noble or as personal as we like to believe. He argued that much of what we pursue, whether it's wealth, status, or romance, is not driven by true fulfillment, but by blind, biological forces. Love, according to Schopenhauer, is not a magical, transcendent experience. It is nature's way of ensuring reproduction, tricking us into attaching meaning to something that, at its core, is just an instinct. This is why romantic relationships are so often filled with suffering. The idealized version of love we are sold, one of perfect harmony, deep understanding, and lifelong passion, is rarely reflected in reality. Instead, relationships are filled with compromise, misunderstanding, and disappointment. We expect our partners to complete us, to provide happiness, to fill a void that we fear facing alone. But this is exactly the problem. The moment we seek fulfillment in another person, we place our happiness outside of our control. Schopenhauer saw this as one of the great tragedies of human existence. People do not love for the reasons they think they do. They believe they are making a rational, personal choice, but in reality, they are acting out ancient biological scripts, shaped by evolutionary pressures they do not understand. This is why people fall in love with those who complement them in ways they cannot consciously explain. They are drawn to qualities that would produce the most genetically fit offspring, not necessarily those that would make them happiest. But here's the paradox. While love may serve a biological function, it often makes individuals weaker rather than stronger. The intensity of romantic passion can lead people to lose themselves, to make irrational choices, to compromise their ambitions, their independence, their very identity. They become consumed by the relationship, prioritizing the emotions of their partner over their own self-development. And when the illusion fades, when reality sets in and the initial excitement disappears, what remains is often disappointment. The person who once seemed perfect now seems flawed, ordinary. The intense longing transforms into familiarity, and for many, dissatisfaction. It is at this stage that people begin to question whether they were ever truly in love, whether they made the right choice, whether they should leave and start the cycle again with someone new. Schopenhauer believed that this cycle, the euphoric highs and crushing lows of romantic love, was a form of suffering that intelligent individuals could see through. He saw the wisdom in detaching from these illusions, in not allowing oneself to be consumed by desires that only lead to disappointment. To him, the person who can stand alone, who does not need external validation, who does not seek completion in another, is truly free. But if this is true, why do we continue to chase love despite the suffering it brings? Why do we willingly fall into the same patterns, despite knowing how they often end? The answer, Schopenhauer argued, lies in the way society glorifies relationships. We are bombarded with messages that tell us love is the key to happiness, that being single is a temporary condition rather than a valid choice. We are made to feel incomplete if we do not have a partner, as if our worth is tied to whether or not we are desired by someone else. If Schopenhauer was right, that true freedom comes from detaching oneself from the illusions of love, then what does a life of solitude truly offer? Many people assume that being single is a condition of lacking something, of missing out on an essential human experience. But this perspective is based on a flawed premise. It assumes that love is the pinnacle of existence, that to be single is to be incomplete. Schopenhauer would argue the opposite. Solitude is not an absence, but a presence. It is the ability to be entirely yourself, free from the compromises and distractions that relationships demand. When you remove the constant emotional turbulence of romantic relationships, something profound happens. You gain clarity. The highs and lows, the obsessive thoughts, the anxieties over how someone else feels about you, all of these vanish, leaving behind a mind that is free to think, to create, and to understand itself. Schopenhauer believed that solitude is the condition in which true wisdom is cultivated. Great thinkers, artists, and philosophers throughout history have often lived in isolation, not because they were incapable of love, but because they saw something more valuable in solitude, the opportunity to develop their minds without interference. Consider how much of life is dictated by relationships. People move cities, change careers, sacrifice personal ambitions, all in the name of love. This is not necessarily a bad thing, but it raises an important question. How much of what we pursue is truly our own desire, and how much is shaped by the expectations and emotions of others? Schopenhauer saw romantic relationships as a force that often pulls people away from their true path. He believed that the person who stands alone, who is not swayed by the desires of others, has the rare opportunity to live authentically. And this is where being single transforms from a passive state into an active advantage. It is not about rejecting love out of bitterness or fear, but about consciously choosing a life where your time, energy, and thoughts are fully your own. The single individual is free to explore, to take risks, to shape their life in a way that is completely self-directed. There are no emotional entanglements clouding their judgment, no obligations forcing them to compromise. They can move, create, and grow without limitation. This is why Schopenhauer saw solitude not as loneliness, but as liberation. He believed that most people fear being alone because they do not know how to fill the silence. They seek constant distraction, whether through relationships, entertainment, or social validation, because being alone forces them to confront themselves. But the person who embraces solitude discovers something extraordinary: the ability to be at peace with their own company. And once you develop this, you become untouchable. You are no longer controlled by the fear of losing someone because you were never dependent on them to begin with. But beyond the personal freedom that solitude grants, there is another significant advantage. It allows for deeper, more meaningful self-reflection. Relationships often force people into roles. They mold individuals into expectations, what a partner should be, how they should act, what they should desire. In solitude, these expectations disappear. You can ask yourself who you truly are, beyond external influences. What do you want? What do you believe? What kind of life do you want to live? These are questions that are difficult to answer when your identity is entangled with someone else's. Of course, this is not to say that all relationships are bad or that love should be avoided altogether. Even Schopenhauer, despite his harsh critique of romantic illusions, acknowledged that deep, genuine connections could be meaningful. But the key is to ensure that such relationships do not come at the cost of your independence. If love enhances your life without diminishing your sense of self, it can be valuable. But if it becomes a source of suffering, distraction, or compromise, then solitude is the wiser path. And yet, society continues to tell us that being single is a problem, that we must always be searching for someone, that to be alone is to be lacking. But what if, instead of seeing solitude as something to escape, we started seeing it as something to cultivate? If solitude grants freedom, then the next question is, what do you do with that freedom? Many people who are single feel lost, as if they are waiting for something to fill the space that a relationship is supposed to occupy. But Schopenhauer would argue that this mindset is the problem itself. To live fully in solitude, you must shift your perspective, not seeing it as an absence, but as an opportunity. Being single is not just about avoiding the complications of love. It is about using your time and energy to cultivate something far more valuable: the mastery of yourself. Schopenhauer believed that most people drift through life, led by their impulses and external influences, rarely taking control of their own direction. Love, in his view, was one of the most powerful distractions because it convinced people that their happiness depended on someone else. But the moment you stop chasing relationships as a source of fulfillment, you are left with a question that many people avoid: what now? This is where the true power of solitude begins. With no emotional entanglements to dictate your actions, you are free to develop yourself in ways that many never do. You can immerse yourself in intellectual pursuits, dedicate yourself to mastering a craft, or push your body and mind to new limits. The time that others spend on romantic drama, conflicts, and compromises, you can spend on building something lasting. History is filled with great minds who used solitude to their advantage: writers, artists, philosophers. Many of them thrived precisely because they did not let relationships consume their energy. Schopenhauer saw solitude as the natural state of the thinker. He argued that wisdom, creativity, and intellectual depth come from long periods of reflection, undisturbed by the noise of society. But this kind of solitude is not passive. It is not about simply being alone. It is about using that aloneness to strengthen yourself. It is a period of deep self-education, of challenging your own thoughts, of creating a life that is rich and meaningful, not because of external validation, but because you have designed it yourself. And yet, solitude is not always easy. The modern world is built to keep people constantly engaged, constantly interacting, constantly connected. Social media, entertainment, dating culture, all of these create the illusion that being alone is unnatural, that you should always be talking to someone, that you should always be pursuing relationships. But stepping away from this pressure is where the real transformation happens. The person who can sit in silence and be completely at peace is someone who has mastered themselves in a way that most people never will. This self-mastery does not mean rejecting love altogether. It means that if you ever do choose to be in a relationship, it is because it truly adds value to your life, not because you are running from solitude. It means that you never sacrifice your individuality for the sake of companionship. It means that if love comes, it is a bonus, not a necessity. Schopenhauer believed that the happiest individuals were those who did not depend on others for their fulfillment. They had cultivated an internal world so rich that even when they were alone, they were never truly lacking anything. But what about the fear of loneliness? Many people stay in relationships, even unhappy ones, simply because they do not want to be alone. But there is a fundamental difference between solitude and loneliness. Loneliness is a craving for connection that is not being met. Solitude is a choice. When you embrace it fully, you do not feel the absence of others. You feel the presence of yourself. You develop a mind so strong that it is capable of finding meaning in your own company. This is where being single becomes a superpower. Because if you are not dependent on anyone for your happiness, you are untouchable. You do not need validation. You do not need approval. You do not need to conform to the expectations that relationships impose. Instead, you carve out a life that is uniquely your own. Once you embrace solitude not as an absence but as an opportunity, the next step is knowing how to use it wisely. Many people fear being single because they equate it with stagnation, but Schopenhauer saw solitude as the opposite. It is the ultimate condition for personal growth. When you are not bound by the expectations and compromises of a relationship, you are free to invest in yourself in ways that most people never do. The first key to mastering solitude is intellectual expansion. Schopenhauer himself was deeply influenced by Eastern philosophy, particularly Buddhism, which emphasizes detachment as a means of enlightenment. He believed that the pursuit of knowledge was one of the highest forms of fulfillment, far beyond the fleeting pleasures of romance. Being single means you can dedicate time to reading, studying, and understanding the world on a deeper level. The hours that many spend on dating, emotional conflicts, and social obligations can instead be used to expand your mind, gaining insights that make you wiser, more perceptive, and ultimately more content in your own company. But knowledge alone is not enough. Physical and mental discipline are equally important. Many people rely on relationships to regulate their emotions, to provide them with comfort, or to give them a sense of stability. But true self-mastery means learning to cultivate these things from within. Whether through physical training, meditation, or creative expression, solitude allows you to develop resilience. When you no longer depend on others for emotional support, you become unshakable. You learn to face difficulties alone, and in doing so, you become stronger than those who constantly seek external validation. Another essential aspect of making solitude a superpower is creative independence. Some of the greatest works of art, literature, and philosophy were created by those who spent long periods in isolation. Dostoevsky, Nietzsche, and of course, Schopenhauer himself all used solitude to refine their thoughts and produce ideas that shaped the world. When you are not distracted by relationship drama or social pressures, you have the space to create. Whether it's writing, painting, building a business, or exploring new skills, being single gives you the time and mental clarity to cultivate your own unique contributions to the world. However, there is one challenge that often comes with solitude: the need for meaning. Many people fall into the trap of chasing relationships because they believe love will give their lives purpose. But Schopenhauer warned against this illusion. He saw romantic love as a biological trap, a force that keeps people in a cycle of desire, attachment, and suffering. Instead of looking for meaning in another person, he argued that individuals should create their own meaning. This could come from personal achievements, intellectual pursuits, or even spiritual reflection. But perhaps the most powerful transformation that solitude offers is a shift in identity. In relationships, people often lose themselves in the roles they play. They become someone's partner rather than a fully realized individual. But in solitude, you are forced to confront who you truly are without the influence of another person shaping your identity. This can be uncomfortable, even painful, but it is also the only way to develop a sense of self that is truly independent. To live a life of deep fulfillment without the need for relationships, you must develop internal stability. This means creating a routine that strengthens your mind and body, setting personal goals that challenge you, and cultivating interests that bring you joy. It means finding a sense of purpose that is not dependent on another person, but rooted in your own existence. But solitude does not mean isolation. Schopenhauer did not advocate for complete withdrawal from society, but rather for selective engagement. He believed that intelligent people should be cautious about who they allow into their lives. Instead of surrounding yourself with acquaintances for the sake of socializing, focus on a few deep, meaningful connections with people who share your values. A life of solitude does not mean being alone in every sense. It means being free to choose your interactions without needing them for validation. Once you recognize the power of solitude and begin to shape it into a source of strength, the final step is learning how to sustain it. Many people misunderstand solitude as something temporary, something to be endured rather than embraced. But Schopenhauer's philosophy shows us that true independence isn't just about avoiding relationships. It's about building a life so rich and fulfilling that you no longer feel the need for one. The key to this lies in self-sufficiency. A person who depends on external sources for happiness will always be vulnerable to loss, rejection, and disappointment. But a person who learns to find fulfillment within themselves becomes immune to these struggles. This is why Schopenhauer believed that the greatest minds in history were often solitary. They cultivated a level of inner richness that made external distractions unnecessary. Their happiness was not built on fleeting pleasures or romantic validation, but on the depth of their thoughts, the mastery of their skills, and the clarity of their purpose. To achieve this, you must structure your life around what truly matters to you. Without the distractions of relationship drama or the need to conform to another person's expectations, you have complete freedom to design your days around what excites you. This might mean traveling alone, immersing yourself in creative projects, or dedicating yourself to intellectual pursuits. It means becoming comfortable with your own company, finding joy in solitude rather than fearing it. But the most challenging aspect of sustaining this lifestyle is resisting societal pressure. We live in a world that equates happiness with relationships, that tells us we must find our other half to be complete. This illusion is deeply ingrained in culture, literature, and even psychology. Yet Schopenhauer's insight was that true fulfillment comes not from attachment, but from detachment. The more you separate yourself from the need for validation, the freer you become. This doesn't mean rejecting love entirely. It means redefining what love actually is. Instead of seeking a relationship to fill a void, you recognize that love, if it happens, should be an addition to your life, not the foundation of it. It should be something that enhances, not something that controls. When you see love from this perspective, it becomes clear that being single is not an absence, but a presence, a state of strength, not weakness. This is why some of the most powerful, creative, and successful individuals in history have lived solitary lives. They understood that their energy was best used for building something meaningful, rather than chasing fleeting emotional highs. They were free to evolve without compromise, to explore the world without restriction, to pursue excellence without distraction. The final transformation happens when you no longer see solitude as something to be explained or defended, but simply as the most natural way to live. You no longer feel the need to justify why you are single, because the results of your independence, your success, your clarity, your sense of purpose speak for themselves. You become someone who is self-contained, unshakable, and in control of their own destiny. So ask yourself, are you willing to step beyond the illusions that society sells you? Are you ready to embrace the kind of independence that most people will never experience? If so, then know this. Being single is not just a phase or a fallback option or something to be fixed. It is a superpower. And once you truly embrace it, you will never see relationships or the need for them the same way again.